The rain had been falling since before dawn, tapping gently against the kitchen windows of my little farmhouse outside, Asheville, North Carolina. It was the kind of slow, steady rain that made the whole world feel quieter, softer somehow. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and stood by the window, watching drops race down the glass. At 64 years old, my mornings had become wonderfully predictable. Coffee at 6, feed my golden retriever Daisy, read a few chapters of whatever library book I had borrowed that week, then spend the afternoon tending the flower beds my late father had planted decades earlier. It wasn't the glamorous life I had imagined when I was 25, but it was peaceful. And after everything I'd survived, peace felt like wealth. People in town often asked why I never remarried. I'd smile politely and say, some chapters are meant to stay closed. Only I knew that mine had never truly closed. Not completely, because every April 23rd, I still bought a single white lily. Every year, without fail. No one knew why. Not even my closest friend, Martha. They thought it honored my parents. But it didn't. The flower was for a little girl who had supposedly lived only 3 days. A daughter I had never been allowed to hold long enough. A daughter whose tiny face had faded from memory years ago. Sometimes I wondered if I'd imagined her. Sometimes grief plays tricks on a mother's mind. The doctors had told me she died from complications shortly after birth. Daniel handled everything. He said I was too weak after the emergency surgery. He arranged the funeral, signed the paperwork, told me there was no reason for me to suffer through seeing such a tiny coffin. I believed him. Because back then, I trusted my husband with my life. Looking back now, that was my greatest mistake. I was still lost in those thoughts when Daisy suddenly barked. Not her playful bark, her warning bark. Someone was outside. I looked toward the front porch. A black luxury sedan sat in my gravel driveway. It looked painfully out of place beside my old pickup truck. No one I knew drove a car like that. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door. The knock came again. 3 slow taps, almost hesitant. I opened the door. For one impossible second, I thought I was seeing a ghost. Daniel Harper, 30 years older. His dark hair had turned silver. His shoulders, once broad and confident, had slumped with age. The expensive suit couldn't hide how thin he'd become. The confident smile that used to charm every room was gone. Instead, he looked frightened. Truly frightened. Neither of us spoke. 30 years of silence stood between us. Finally, he whispered my name. Emily. The sound of my name in his voice sent memories crashing through me. Our first apartment, our wedding dance, late-night milkshakes after work, building our first home together, holding hands while dreaming about children. Then, the lies, the affair, the divorce papers, watching him drive away with a woman 15 years younger than me. Every memory arrived at once, like shattered glass. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice colder than I expected. I know I don't deserve 5 minutes of your time. You're right. I need to tell you something. I don't care. His eyes filled with tears. Real tears. Not the fake ones he'd used during divorce court. I have terminal cancer. I stared at him. People expect news like that to erase decades of pain. It doesn't. It simply becomes another fact. I'm sorry you're sick, I answered honestly. But it changes nothing. I know. He reached inside his leather briefcase. For one strange moment, I wondered if he had come to ask for forgiveness. Instead, he removed a thick manila envelope. I've carried this for 30 years. He held it out with shaking hands. I should have told you the truth the day it happened. I don't want anything from you. You need to read it. No, Emily! I buried our marriage a long time ago. His face crumbled. I know, but you never buried our daughter. The words froze the air around us. Every sound disappeared. Even the rain seemed to stop. My daughter is dead. His lips trembled. No. I felt anger rise so suddenly it almost made me dizzy. Don't. I swear to God. Don't you dare. She never died. The world tilted beneath my feet. I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because the sentence was impossible. Cruel. Insane. You've finally lost your mind. I wish I had. He carefully placed the envelope on the porch floor between us. I don't expect you to believe me. I don't. The proof is inside. I looked at the envelope but refused to touch it. For 30 years, I'd rebuilt my life one painful brick at a time. I wasn't about to let the man who destroyed it tear everything apart again. What kind of sick game is this? No game. Leave. Emily! Leave before I call the sheriff. He nodded slowly. I deserve that. He turned toward the driveway, then stopped. Without facing me, he said quietly, My wife doesn't know. My sons don't know. My grandchildren don't know. They think I'm an honest man. His shoulders shook. They'll know soon. He climbed into the black sedan. The engine started. Seconds later, the car disappeared down the rain-soaked road. I stood frozen in the doorway. Daisy gently nudged my hand. Then I looked down. The envelope was still there. Water soaked its corners. For nearly 10 minutes, I simply stared at it. Every instinct screamed not to touch it. Some secrets should stay buried. Some doors should never be opened. But another voice, the voice every mother carries forever, whispered one impossible question. What if? My fingers trembled as I bent down. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Inside were dozens of documents. Hospital records, old photographs, legal forms, and on top, a handwritten letter. I recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. The first sentence stole every breath from my lungs. If you're reading this, I finally found the courage to confess the greatest sin of my life. I slowly turned the page, and before I reached the second paragraph, I realized everything I believed about the last 30 years might have been built on one horrifying lie. The rain continued long after Daniel's car disappeared, but I never noticed. I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the letter in my hands as if the ink might rearrange itself into something less impossible. Daisy rested her head against my knee, sensing something was terribly wrong. For several minutes, I couldn't force myself to read another word. The first sentence had already shattered the foundation of my life. If you're reading this, I finally found the courage to confess the greatest sin of my life. I sat at the old oak table where I had shared thousands of meals with Daniel before our marriage fell apart. My hand shook so badly that a drop of coffee spilled across the page. I wiped it away carefully. Then I began reading. Emily, if there were any other way to tell you this, I would choose it. There isn't. 30 years ago, on the night our daughter was born, the doctor told me she was healthy. She cried. She breathed. She squeezed my finger. You never imagined those things. They happened. I saw them with my own eyes. I felt the room spin. Healthy? She was healthy? The doctors had told me she died only hours after birth. I remembered the nurse squeezing my hand, the doctor avoiding my eyes, Daniel holding me while I cried. Had every one of them lied? I forced myself to continue. After your emergency surgery, you lost a great deal of blood. The doctors feared you wouldn't survive. While you were unconscious, another family arrived at the hospital. They were wealthy, powerful. Their newborn daughter had died during delivery. The mother suffered a mental breakdown and refused to believe her baby was gone. Her husband offered me something I still hate myself for considering. Money. Enough money to erase every debt we had. Enough to save the construction company from bankruptcy. Enough to pay for your medical care. Enough to give us the life I thought you deserved. At first, I refused. Then he said something I have never forgotten. Your wife may not survive. If she dies, what kind of life can you give that baby alone? I stopped reading. The room felt smaller, harder to breathe. No. The word escaped my lips before I realized I had spoken aloud. Daisy looked up at me. I wanted the letter to be fake. A cruel joke. Anything but the truth. But Daniel's handwriting, his details, they were too real. I kept reading. I made the worst decision any father could ever make. I signed papers that should never have existed. They took our daughter. The hospital records were changed. Her identity disappeared. You were told she had died. The other family left with our baby. And I accepted the money. I covered my mouth. The letter slipped from my fingers onto the table. For 30 years, I had believed my daughter rested beneath a tiny white headstone in a cemetery outside town. Every April, I placed a white lily there. Every birthday, I whispered, "I miss you." There had never been a child buried beneath that stone. Only my grief. I stumbled into the bathroom and vomited. The betrayal was too large for my mind to understand. When I returned to the kitchen, I noticed something inside the envelope I hadn't seen before. A faded photograph. A newborn baby wrapped in a pink blanket. Tiny fingers. Dark hair. Eyes tightly closed. Written on the back in blue ink were 4 words. Baby girl Harper. The date matched the day I gave birth. Tears blurred my vision. This was the only photograph anyone had ever taken of my daughter. The daughter I had spent 3 decades mourning. I pressed the picture against my chest. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I didn't know." There was another document. A cashier's check. $300,000. Issued exactly 1 week after our daughter's birth. The signature belonged to a man I'd never heard of. Richard Langston. The amount made my stomach twist. That was the price. The price Daniel accepted. The price of a baby. The price of destroying a mother's heart. Another folded sheet rested beneath the check. It wasn't written by Daniel. It was a copy of an old letter from a lawyer. One sentence caught my attention immediately. The child has legally assumed the name Olivia Langston in all previous birth. Records have been permanently sealed. Olivia. She had a name. Not just baby girl Harper. Olivia. I repeated it softly. Olivia. It felt unfamiliar. Yet somehow, it felt like home. By evening, I had read Daniel's confession 6 times. Each time, another detail struck me. He never claimed innocence. He never blamed anyone else. Every page admitted what he had done. How guilt destroyed his second marriage. How he secretly followed Olivia's life from a distance. How he watched her graduate from high school, college, medical school, never once speaking to her, never once telling her who she really was. The final page read, "Emily, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But Olivia deserves the truth. She deserves to know the woman who gave her life never abandoned her. I enclosed everything you'll need to find her. Please, don't let me die before she knows who her real mother is. Daniel." I stared out the kitchen window long after sunset. Somewhere, perhaps only a few hundred miles away, a woman around 30 years old was living her life. She might have children. She might have my smile, my laugh, my mother's green eyes. She had no idea I existed. And I had no idea she existed until today. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I picked up the telephone. Not to call Daniel. Not yet. I called the number listed on the old legal papers. A law office in Charlotte. The receptionist answered politely. "Good morning, Langston and Pierce." My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own voice. I'm looking for someone named Olivia Langston." There was a brief pause. Then the woman replied, "I'm sorry, ma'am. Dr. Olivia Langston no longer uses that name?" The words made my pulse stop. She was married 3 years ago. The receptionist smiled through the phone. Her name is now... She spoke 3 simple words. 3 words that changed everything again. Because the last name she said wasn't Langston. It was Harper. I nearly dropped the phone. "A Harper?" I whispered. The receptionist repeated it. "Yes, ma'am, Dr. Olivia Harper. Is there something I can help you with?" My heart pounded so hard it felt painful. Harper? Out of every last name in America? How could she possibly have ended up with mine? I swallowed. I think there must be some mistake. "I'm sorry?" "I knew someone named Olivia Langston years ago. She changed her name after marrying Dr. Ethan Harper." The words hit me like ice water. Not Daniel Harper. Not our family. Just a coincidence. Or so I wanted to believe. I thanked the receptionist and ended the call. For several minutes, I simply sat in silence. The emotional storm inside me had become impossible to control. Somewhere in the world lived a woman named Olivia Harper. A doctor. Married. Living a successful life. A life that should have belonged to my daughter. Because it was my daughter. Yet she had no idea. I spread every document across the kitchen table. Hospital records, old legal forms, Daniel's confession. There had to be something I had missed. Then I noticed a business card tucked inside the envelope. Margaret Ellis, licensed private investigator, Charlotte, North Carolina. On the back, Daniel had written only one sentence. She knows everything. I picked up the phone. A calm older woman's voice answered. This is Margaret. My name is Emily Harper. Silence. A long, painful silence. Finally, she sighed. I wondered if this day would ever come. You know who I am? I've known about you for almost 15 years. My breath caught. Daniel hired me. He wanted to find Olivia. He already knew where she was. He wanted someone to watch over her from a distance. I closed my eyes. So he really spent all these years following her? Not stalking. Protecting. He paid for anonymous scholarships. He secretly covered medical bills when her adoptive parents couldn't. He made donations to the university she attended. He even helped save her clinic from closing during the pandemic. I felt anger rising again. So he tried to buy his conscience. No, Margaret answered gently. He was trying to love her the only way he believed he still could. But he never had the courage to tell the truth. I drove to Charlotte the following morning. The 3-hour drive passed in a blur. Margaret Ellis welcomed me into a small office, filled with filing cabinets and family photographs. She looked to be in her 70s. Kind eyes, silver hair, the face of someone who had carried difficult secrets. She handed me a thick folder. This belongs to you now. Inside were photographs. Hundreds of them. Olivia at 5 years old, holding a puppy. Olivia winning a spelling bee. Olivia playing soccer. Olivia graduating high school. College. Medical school. Her wedding. 30 years. Captured in pictures. 30 years. I had missed every birthday. Every Christmas. Every scraped knee. Every achievement. Every heartbreak. I gently touched a wedding photograph. She looked so much like my mother that tears instantly filled my eyes. Same smile, same dimples, same bright green eyes. I've missed her whole life. Margaret reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. No, you had your life stolen. Those words broke something inside me. For the first time in decades, I cried without trying to stop. When I finally composed myself, I asked the question that had haunted me since reading Daniel's letter. Why now? Why tell me after 30 years? Margaret's expression grew serious. Because Daniel is dying. I know that. There's more. She opened another file. Inside was a recent newspaper article. A smiling Daniel stood beside an elegant blonde woman and 2 young men. The headline read, Local Business Icon Daniel. Harper to retire after donating. $25 million to Children's Hospital. Perfect family. Perfect reputation. Perfect legacy. Until now. Margaret pointed toward another document. Daniel signed a sworn confession. He submitted copies to his attorney. If he dies before telling the truth publicly, the documents will automatically be released. I stared at her. Released to whom? The police. The media. His family. The hospital. Everyone. So his perfect life ends the day the truth comes out. Margaret nodded. He says he doesn't deserve to die respected. That afternoon, I left Margaret's office carrying the heavy folder. Before driving home, I stopped outside the medical clinic where Olivia worked. I stayed across the street. I told myself I wasn't ready. I only wanted one glimpse. Patients walked in and out. Doctors hurried through the parking lot. Then, the front doors opened. A woman in a white coat stepped outside. She laughed at something a nurse had said. My breath disappeared. She looked exactly the way I imagined my daughter would. Dark chestnut hair, green eyes, a gentle smile. She bent down to speak with a frightened little boy before helping him into his mother's car. The boy hugged her tightly. She hugged him back. Kindness radiated from her. I watched with tears streaming down my face. Without realizing it, I whispered, That's my little girl. I wanted to run across the street, tell her everything, wrap my arms around her. But how do you tell a 30-year-old woman, I'm your mother? The parents who raised you unknowingly bought you. The father you admired sold you. Everything you've believed about your life is a lie. I couldn't. Not yet. As I turned toward my car, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Daniel's number. For several seconds, I debated ignoring it. Finally, I answered. His voice sounded weaker than before. Did you find her? Yes. A long silence. Then I heard him quietly crying. Is she happy? I looked across the street as Olivia smiled at another patient. Yes. She became exactly the kind of woman we dreamed she'd be. Daniel sobbed openly. Thank God. I should have hated him. Part of me still did. But another part heard only a dying father drowning in 30 years of regret. Then his voice suddenly changed. Urgent. Panicked. Emily! They know. Who knows? My wife. My sons. They found the confession. Before I could respond, a woman screamed in the background. Then a man's furious voice shouted, You sold your own baby? Glass shattered. Someone yelled, Get out of this house! The line went dead. I stared at the silent phone. Daniel's perfect life had just begun to collapse, and I had a terrible feeling. The worst was still to come. For nearly a minute, I sat motionless in my car, staring at the dark phone screen. Daniel's final words echoed in my head. They found the confession. I looked across the street one last time. Olivia had gone back inside the clinic. She had no idea that at this very moment, the life she believed was built on certainty was beginning to crumble. I whispered a silent prayer. Please, let her hear it from me. Then I started the engine and drove home. The next morning, I was watering my roses when Martha came running across my front yard. She was 72, but I'd never seen her move so fast. Emily, she shouted. Turn on your television. Right now. My stomach tightened. Inside, I grabbed the remote. Every local news station was carrying the same breaking story. A reporter stood outside Daniel Harper's estate. Police cars lined the driveway. Cameras crowded the front gate. The headline across the screen read, Local philanthropist accused of hiding 30-year family secret. The reporter spoke calmly. Late last night, documents believed to have been written by businessman Daniel Harper were leaked to multiple media outlets. The documents allegedly confessed to an illegal arrangement involving the disappearance of a newborn child more than 30 years ago. Authorities have confirmed that an investigation has been opened. My hands began to shake. The story continued. Neighbors described Daniel as honest. Church members called him generous. Former employees said he had changed countless lives. Now, everyone was asking the same question. Who was the missing child? The phone rang every few minutes. Friends, former coworkers, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. I ignored every call. By afternoon, another headline appeared online. Harper family cuts ties with patriarch. Daniel's second wife, Victoria, had released a short statement. The actions described in these reports are horrifying. My children and I had no knowledge of them. We ask for privacy during this painful time. His two sons had resigned from the family company. Board members announced an emergency meeting. Charities quietly removed Daniel's name from their websites. In less than 24 hours, 30 years of carefully built respect had vanished. Late that evening, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, Margaret Ellis stood there. She looked exhausted. I thought you should know before you see it online. She handed me a sealed envelope. Daniel asked me to give you this only if everything became public. Inside was a single handwritten note. Emily, by the time you read this, I've probably lost everything. I deserve it. But there's one thing I'm begging you to believe. Victoria didn't know. My sons didn't know. No one did. This shame belongs to me alone. Please don't punish them for my sins. And one more thing. Olivia called me today. She doesn't know who I really am. She only knows I'm the man whose confession is all over the news. She asked one question that shattered me. Did my real mother know? I couldn't answer. Because only you deserve to answer that. Daniel. I folded the letter slowly. That single question tore through my heart. Did my real mother know? No. I hadn't known. Not for one single day. The following morning, my cell phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. Mrs. Harper? Yes? My name is Ethan Harper. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Olivia's husband. I hope I'm not disturbing you. His voice was calm but tense. I believe we need to meet. Every muscle in my body tightened. Does Olivia know who I am? There was a long pause. No, but she knows someone is hiding the truth. My heart raced. I found your number among the documents left by Mr. Harper. He took a slow breath. I don't know everything, but I know enough to understand my wife deserves answers. He hesitated before saying something that caught me completely off guard. She's been crying since yesterday. She keeps saying she feels like her entire life belongs to someone else. Tears filled my eyes. Even without knowing the truth, a daughter could somehow feel the emptiness left by it. We agreed to meet the next afternoon at a quiet lakeside park. Halfway between our homes, I barely slept that night. I practiced the words over and over. I'm your mother. Nothing sounded right. Nothing sounded possible. How do you explain 30 years stolen by someone else's decision? How do you ask a stranger to believe that every birthday candle you blew out, every graduation, every wedding, her real mother missed because she thought she was dead? There were no words big enough. The next afternoon, I arrived 30 minutes early. The park was peaceful. Children laughed on the playground. A young couple fed ducks by the water. Life carried on as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen. At exactly 2 o'clock, a silver SUV pulled into the parking lot. Ethan stepped out first. He was kind-faced, probably in his mid-30s. Then he opened the passenger door. Olivia climbed out. For a moment, she simply stood there, scanning the park. When her eyes met mine, something strange happened. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us spoke. Yet it felt as though we had known each other forever. She slowly walked toward me, stopping only a few feet away. I don't know why, she said softly, but looking at you feels familiar. My throat tightened. I wanted to reach for her hand. Instead, I whispered, "Thank you for coming." She nodded. Then she asked the question I had feared most. Are you the woman from the confession? I closed my eyes for a brief moment. When I opened them again, I knew there was no turning back. With tears already streaming down my face, I answered the question that had waited 30 years to be spoken. Yes, I am. And Olivia, I took one trembling step closer. I'm the mother who has been looking for you, every single day, without even knowing you were alive. Olivia's eyes widened. The color drained from her face. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to stand still. Then she whispered one word, "Mom?" And everything changed. The word barely escaped Olivia's lips. Mom? It wasn't loud. It wasn't certain. It was fragile, as though she feared saying it might make the entire moment disappear. My heart broke all over again. For 30 years, I had imagined hearing my daughter call me Mom. In every dream, she was a little girl with pigtails, running into my arms after school. Instead, the woman standing before me was 30 years old, wearing a white doctor's coat beneath her light jacket, with tears filling the same green eyes I saw every morning in my own mirror. I don't know if I have the right to call you that, she whispered. You've always had that right, I replied through tears. I just never had the chance to hear it. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Olivia did something neither of us expected. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. I held her as tightly as I could. 30 years of birthdays, 30 years of Christmas mornings, 30 years of hugs that never happened, all poured out in that single embrace. People walking through the park smiled politely, unaware that a mother and daughter were meeting for the very first time. When we finally sat on a nearby bench, Ethan quietly walked toward the lake. I'll give you two some privacy, he said gently. I silently thanked him. Olivia wiped her eyes. I've read Daniel's confession 3 times. She hesitated before saying his name. I can't call him my father anymore. I nodded slowly. You don't have to decide today who he is. She looked down at her hands. I love the people who raised me. I still do. They were wonderful parents. Please tell me they knew nothing. I honestly believe they didn't. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. They loved you? More than anything. She smiled sadly. My mother stayed awake every night when I had pneumonia. My father never missed a soccer game. They celebrated every birthday. They taught me kindness. I don't want to hate them. You don't have to. The choices Daniel made were his alone. After several minutes of silence, Olivia asked the question I had dreaded. What happened the day I was born? I took a slow breath. The truth? I only know part of it. Then I told her everything. How Daniel and I had struggled for years to have a child. How we decorated a tiny nursery in soft yellow because we wanted the baby's gender to be a surprise. How your grandfather built a wooden cradle with his own hands. How labor came 2 weeks early. How everything became a blur after the emergency surgery. I remember waking up. Daniel was crying. He held my hand and told me our baby hadn't survived. My world ended right there. Olivia reached across the bench and held my hand. You believed him? I trusted him more than I trusted myself. She closed her eyes. I can't imagine living with that pain. I couldn't either. But somehow, you wake up the next morning, and the next, and the next. Eventually, people expect you to smile again. So you do, even when your heart never fully heals. For nearly 2 hours, we talked. Not as strangers. Not yet as mother and daughter, but as two women trying to rebuild 30 years stolen by one terrible decision. She showed me photographs on her phone. Her wedding. Her medical school graduation. Family vacations. I smiled through tears at every picture. Then she stopped on one image. A little girl with curly brown hair. About 5 years old? My daughter, Olivia whispered. My Emily. I looked at her in surprise. You named her Emily? She nodded. I always loved that name. I don't know why. A sob escaped before I could stop it. Without realizing it, my daughter had named her own daughter after me. She had never known me. Yet somehow, part of me had always been with her. That evening, Olivia came home with me. She wanted to see the farmhouse, the flower garden, the old oak tree where Daniel had once hung a tire swing. Inside the living room, she noticed dozens of white lilies painted in watercolor. You really like these flowers? I smiled sadly. I bought one every April 23rd. For you. Her eyes filled again. You remembered my birthday? Every year. I thought I was placing flowers on my daughter's grave. I never imagined she was somewhere celebrating another birthday. Neither of us spoke after that. Words weren't enough. Just before sunset, my phone rang. Daniel. I looked at Olivia. She quietly nodded. You should answer. I stepped onto the front porch. His voice was weaker than ever. Did you meet her? Yes. A long silence. Then I heard him crying softly. Is she all right? No. But she will be. Another silence. Then he asked, Did she hate me? I couldn't lie. She's hurt. Confused. Angry. But more than anything, she's grieving 30 years she can never get back. I know. I've grieved them every day. He coughed violently. When he finally caught his breath, he whispered, I have one last request. I closed my eyes. I'm listening. I don't want forgiveness. I only want one chance to tell Olivia I'm sorry. Face to face. If she refuses, I'll understand. But if she agrees, I'd like her to hear the truth from me before I die. I didn't answer immediately, because this decision wasn't mine. It belonged to our daughter. When I returned inside, Olivia was standing by the living room window. She had heard enough to understand. Without asking what he said, she quietly spoke first. I know what he wants. I nodded. She looked toward the fading sunset, then back at me. I don't know if I can forgive him. You don't have to. But she took a deep breath. I think I need to hear him say it. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. None of us knew it then. But before that day ended, another secret, one Daniel himself had never discovered, would come to light. A secret that would prove the tragedy of 30 years ago was even darker than anyone had imagined. None of us slept that night. I sat on the back porch long after midnight, listening to the crickets while Olivia rested in the guest room. Every now and then I caught myself smiling. My daughter was under my roof. It had taken 30 years, but she was here. The joy, however, was tangled with fear. Tomorrow, she would face the man whose decision had stolen 3 decades from both of us. I prayed that whatever happened, it wouldn't destroy the fragile bond we had only just begun to build. The next afternoon, we drove to a private hospice center outside Charlotte. Daniel had insisted on meeting there instead of his home. "I've lost the right to welcome anyone into my house," he had written in a text message. The building overlooked a quiet lake. Everything about it felt peaceful. Too peaceful. A nurse led us to a small room. Daniel was sitting beside the window. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. Only a few days had passed since he appeared at my door, yet he looked years older. His cheeks had sunken. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The confident businessman who once commanded boardrooms had disappeared. Only a dying man remained. He slowly stood when Olivia entered. His eyes immediately filled with tears. He looked at her as though he were seeing the sunrise after 30 years of darkness. "You," his voice cracked, "are beautiful." Olivia remained standing. She didn't smile. She didn't move closer. "You don't get to start with compliments," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "You're right. I don't." For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Daniel looked directly at me. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words carried more pain than I had ever heard from him. "I know they aren't enough. They never will be," I answered honestly. "No, they aren't." He lowered his head. "I expected that." Then Olivia stepped forward. "I only have one question." Daniel looked up. "Anything." "Why?" His shoulders began to shake. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing everything." Our business was failing. We owed more money than we could ever repay. The hospital bills kept growing. When Richard Langston offered me money, he covered his face. I convinced myself I was saving our family. Olivia's voice hardened. "You weren't saving your family. You were selling it." Daniel closed his eyes. "Yes, I was. I've repeated those words to myself every day for 30 years. He reached into a folder beside his chair. "I want you to have this." Olivia hesitated before accepting it. Inside were dozens of canceled checks, anonymous scholarship payments, medical donations, letters that had never been mailed. Every birthday, Daniel had written her a letter. 30 of them. Not one had ever been sent. One letter read, "Today you're 10. I hope someone bought you a birthday cake. I wonder if you like chocolate the way your mother does." Another said, "You're graduating college today. I watched from the last row. You smiled exactly like Emily." Olivia silently wiped away tears. "You watched me? Only from a distance. I never wanted to steal the life you'd built. I only wanted to know you were safe." Just then, someone knocked softly on the door. A woman in her 60s entered. She wore a navy business suit. "My name is Rebecca Sloan," she said. "I'm an attorney." Daniel looked surprised. "I didn't know you were coming." "I wasn't invited." She placed a sealed envelope on the table. "This was delivered to my office yesterday. It concerns the Harper case." She looked directly at Olivia. "And I believe all 3 of you deserve to hear it." Daniel frowned. "What case?" Rebecca carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten statement. It came from a retired nurse. The room fell silent. The nurse worked in the maternity ward the night Olivia was born. My heart began racing. Rebecca adjusted her glasses. She recently entered assisted living. After seeing the news, she decided she couldn't die carrying this secret. Daniel stared at her. "What secret?" Rebecca unfolded the letter. Her voice became almost a whisper. "The nurse states that Mr. Daniel Harper never requested the illegal exchange." Daniel's eyes widened. "What?" According to her statement, Richard Langston approached the hospital administrator first. The administrator then threatened to deny emergency financial assistance unless Mr. Harper cooperated. I felt the blood drain from my face. Rebecca continued. "The nurse claims hospital executives forged several legal documents. They convinced Mr. Harper the arrangement had already been approved." Daniel looked stunned. "No, I signed them." "Yes, but according to this statement, those papers were fraudulent from the beginning." The room went completely still. For 30 years, We had believed one desperate father had committed an unforgivable act. Now we were learning something even darker. A powerful hospital administrator, a wealthy businessman, and others inside the hospital had engineered the entire scheme. Olivia slowly looked at Daniel. "You still signed?" He nodded immediately. "I did. I could have walked away. I could have called the police. I could have fought. I didn't. No matter what anyone else did, the choice I made was mine." Olivia stared at him for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. She reached into her purse. She removed the old photograph of baby girl Harper, the one Daniel had kept for 30 years. She placed it gently into his hands. "You don't deserve forgiveness today." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I know. But," she continued softly, "thank you for finally telling the truth. For the first time since we entered the room." Daniel smiled. Not the smile of a successful businessman. Not the smile of a man trying to impress the world. Just the quiet smile of someone who had carried unbearable guilt for 30 years. Tears rolled down his face. "I can finally breathe." As we prepared to leave, Rebecca stopped us. "One more thing." She handed me another document. The nurse included a list of names. I unfolded it. Hospital executives, doctors, lawyers, Richard Langston, every person connected to the conspiracy. At the bottom, one final handwritten sentence. "Someone else has been searching for Olivia for many years." I looked up. "What does that mean?" Rebecca answered quietly. "The nurse didn't say. But whoever that person is, they've just contacted my office. And they were asking to meet all three of us. The mystery wasn't over. In many ways, it had only just begun." The drive home was silent. Olivia stared out the passenger window, her fingers tracing the edge of the old photograph Daniel had returned to her. I kept replaying the nurse's statement in my mind. Someone else has been searching for Olivia for many years. Who could possibly have cared? Enough to spend decades looking for a child who officially never existed. By the time we reached my farmhouse, neither of us had an answer. The next morning, attorney Rebecca Sloan called. "I've arranged the meeting." "Who is it?" I asked. "I think it's better if she tells you herself." "She?" "Yes. And Emily." Rebecca paused. "Bring Olivia. She has a right to hear this." The meeting was held in a small church outside Asheville. Not in the sanctuary, but in an old fellowship hall with wooden tables and stained glass windows that glowed in the afternoon sun. When Olivia and I walked in, an elderly woman slowly stood. She leaned on a cane. Her white hair was neatly tied back. She looked to be well into her 80s. The moment our eyes met, she burst into tears. "Oh, my sweet girl." She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Olivia. Rebecca gently introduced her. "This is Eleanor Brooks." She was the head maternity nurse the night Olivia was born. The room fell completely silent. Eleanor covered her face. "I've prayed for this day every night for 30 years. Olivia sat beside her. "Were you there?" Eleanor nodded. "I was the one who cleaned you after you were born. I wrapped you in that pink blanket. The same one in the photograph." She looked toward me. "And Emily. I was supposed to place your daughter in your arms." Her voice broke. "I'm so sorry." Tears rolled down my cheeks. "You knew?" "I knew something terrible was happening. I just didn't understand how powerful those men really were." Eleanor explained everything. She had overheard hospital administrators arguing with Richard Langston. She heard money being discussed. She saw paperwork rushed through without proper approval. When she questioned it, she was threatened with losing her nursing license. "I was a widow," she whispered. "I had 2 little boys. I was terrified. I told myself someone else would stop it. No one did." She cried openly. "I've lived with that cowardice every day since." Olivia reached over and squeezed her hand. "You were frightened." "I was. But fear doesn't erase responsibility." "No, it doesn't." Then Eleanor opened an old leather handbag. Inside was a tiny knitted pink baby bootie. Only one. I kept this. My breath caught. When they took Olivia away, one bootie fell from her blanket. "I couldn't throw it away." "I always believed one day I'd find her." She handed it to Olivia. My daughter held the tiny bootie against her heart. I've never owned anything from the day I was born. She smiled through tears. Now I do. Eleanor wasn't finished. There was another reason I asked to meet. She pulled out a worn notebook. Every page contained names, dates, hospital room numbers. I started writing everything I remembered. At first I thought it was only one baby. She shook her head. It wasn't, Rebecca quietly added. Federal investigators have reviewed Eleanor's notes. They believe at least 9 newborns disappeared from that hospital over 12 years. Olivia gasped. 9? Rebecca nodded. The Harpers weren't the only family. The room fell silent. Our tragedy was part of something much larger. News of the investigation spread quickly. Within days, former hospital executives were called in for questioning. Archived records were reopened. Families who had buried newborns decades earlier began requesting DNA testing. Some hoped for miracles. Others feared new heartbreak. The country watched as the scandal grew. But for me, the headlines no longer mattered. I had already found my miracle. 3 days later, Daniel asked to see us one final time. His health had declined rapidly. When we entered his hospice room, he looked impossibly frail. The machines beside his bed beeped softly. He smiled when he saw Olivia. You came. She nodded. I said I would. He looked at me. Emily. I spent 30 years believing punishment would come someday. It finally did. I lost my reputation, my company, my family. He glanced toward the window, and strangely, I finally feel honest. I took a deep breath. Truth has a price. It does. I should have paid it 30 years ago. Daniel asked the nurse to leave us alone. Then he reached beneath his pillow and removed a small wooden box. I made this myself. Inside was a silver locket. When Olivia opened it, she found 2 tiny photographs. One was the newborn picture taken at the hospital. The other was a recent photograph Margaret Ellis had secretly taken of me tending my garden. Daniel smiled weakly. I always hoped that one day you'd both belong in the same picture. Olivia quietly closed the locket. Without saying a word, she walked to his bedside. She took his trembling hand. I can't erase what happened. I may never fully forgive it. Daniel nodded. I understand. But, she continued softly, I don't want your last memory to be hatred. His lips trembled. So, I forgive the man who's telling the truth. But I can never forgive the choice he made. Daniel closed his eyes. A single tear rolled down his cheek. That's more mercy than I deserve. As we prepared to leave, Daniel stopped me. Emily. I turned back. Thank you for giving our daughter back her mother. I looked at Olivia standing beside the window, then back at the man I had once loved. The truth gave her back. It was just waiting 30 years. That evening, just after sunset, Daniel Harper quietly passed away. He died holding the silver locket that contained the only photograph of the daughter. He had loved, too late, but never stopped loving. His death marked the end of one life, yet for Olivia and me, it was finally the beginning of ours. Daniel Harper was buried on a quiet Monday morning. The funeral was nothing like the grand ceremonies he had once imagined. There were no television cameras, no speeches celebrating his business success, no politicians, no wealthy investors, just a handful of people. His 2 sons attended. His wife, Victoria, sat quietly in the front row. Margaret Ellis was there. Attorney Rebecca Sloan stood beside Eleanor Brooks, the retired nurse whose courage had finally uncovered the truth. Olivia and I stood together beneath a gray autumn sky. The pastor spoke only one sentence that truly stayed with me. A person's legacy is not what they hide, but what they finally choose to reveal. Daniel had spent 30 years protecting a lie. In the end, he died protecting the truth. The weeks that followed changed countless lives. Federal investigators confirmed that the hospital had participated in a years-long criminal conspiracy involving falsified birth records, illegal adoptions, and bribery. Several former administrators were charged. The hospital issued a public apology to every affected family. But apologies could never replace stolen years. DNA testing reunited 3 other families, whose children had disappeared decades earlier. Some reunions were joyful. Others were heartbreaking. Not every story ended the way ours had. That realization humbled me every single day. One Saturday morning, Olivia knocked on my front door carrying a cardboard box. I found something in my parents' attic. She still called Richard and Helen Langston her parents. And she always would. They had loved her deeply. The truth about her birth did not erase the love they gave her. Inside the box were dozens of childhood drawings, school projects, birthday cards. Then she pulled out a faded piece of construction paper. I made this when I was 6. Across the top, in crooked crayons, were the words, "Things I wish for." There were only 3 wishes. A puppy, a bicycle, to meet the lady in my dreams. I frowned. The lady in your dreams? Olivia smiled softly. I used to dream about a woman standing in a flower garden. She always smiled at me. I could never see her face clearly. My eyes filled with tears. My garden has always been full of white lilies. She looked around my yard. They were there. I remember them. I thought they were only dreams. Neither of us believed in magic. But sometimes, love leaves memories even when life cannot explain them. Months passed. Our relationship grew naturally. There was no pressure to make up for 30 years overnight. Some weekends she visited my farmhouse. Other weekends I drove to Charlotte. I watched my granddaughter, little Emily, learn to bake chocolate chip cookies in my kitchen. She laughed every time flour landed on her nose. One afternoon she climbed into my lap and asked, "Grandma?" I smiled. "Yes, sweetheart? Were you always my grandma?" I looked at Olivia. She nodded gently. So I answered honestly, "I always loved you. I just didn't know where to find you." The little girl thought for a moment. Then she wrapped her tiny arms around my neck. "That's okay. You found me now." Children have a beautiful way of healing wounds adults overcomplicate. On the first anniversary of Daniel's death, Olivia and I visited the cemetery together. Neither of us brought anger. Neither of us brought bitterness. Only white lilies. We stood quietly before his grave. Finally, Olivia spoke. "I've been thinking about him. So have I. I'll never understand the choice he made. Neither will I. But," she placed the flowers gently on the grass, "I hope he found the peace he couldn't find here." I nodded. So do I. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant refusing to let yesterday steal tomorrow. A few weeks later, Eleanor Brooks called with exciting news. The old maternity wing of the hospital had been demolished. In its place, a memorial garden would be built. Not to honor the hospital, to honor the families. They asked whether I would help choose the flowers. I smiled through tears. There should only be one kind. Months later, the garden opened. Hundreds of white lilies bloomed beneath a simple stone monument. The inscription read, "For every child whose story was hidden, and every family who never stopped loving." People came from across the country. Some cried. Some prayed. Some finally found answers. That evening, after the dedication ceremony, Olivia and I sat together on a wooden bench overlooking the garden. The sun dipped below the trees, bathing everything in golden light. She slipped her hand into mine. "You know, I used to think families were only built by blood." I smiled. "And now? I think they're built by love. Blood tells us where we begin. Love decides where we belong." I squeezed her hand. "Your adoptive parents gave you a beautiful life." "They did. And you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What?" "A second chance at being your mother." She rested her head on my shoulder. "And you gave me something I never knew I was missing. A place where my heart finally makes sense." That night, before leaving for home, Olivia handed me a small wrapped gift. Inside was a brand new family photo album. The first page held only one picture. The photograph Margaret. Ellis had taken years earlier of me standing among my white lilies. Beside it, Olivia had placed a recent photograph of the two of us smiling together. Underneath, she had written, "Chapter 1. I looked at her, confused. "There are only 2 pictures." She laughed. "Exactly. We're not filling the pages with the 30 years we lost. We're filling them with the years we still have." I closed the album and hugged my daughter. Some stories end with revenge. Some end with justice. Ours ended with something far more precious. Hope, because although 30 years had been stolen from us, No one could steal tomorrow. And every spring, when the white lilies bloom outside my farmhouse, my granddaughter runs through the garden laughing while Olivia follows behind her. Sometimes I simply stand there and watch them. Then I whisper the words I once believed I would never get to say. Welcome home, my daughter. And for the first time in more than 30 years, home finally answers back.